The Battle of Kalavrye was fought in 1078 between the Byzantine imperial forces of General Alexios Komnenos and the rebellious governor of Dyrrhachium, Nicephorus Bryennios the Elder. Bryennios had rebelled against Michael VII Ducas and had won over the allegiance of the Byzantine army's regular regiments in the Balkans. Even after Ducas's overthrow by Nicephorus III Botaniates, Bryennios continued his revolt, and threatened Constantinople. After failed negotiations, Botaniates sent the young general Alexios Komnenos with whatever forces he could gather to confront him. The two armies clashed at Kalavrye on the Harmaros River. Alexios Komnenos, whose army was considerably smaller and far less experienced, tried to ambush Bryennios's army. The ambush failed, and the wings of his own army were driven back by the rebels. Alexios himself barely managed to break through with his personal retinue, but succeeded in regrouping his scattered men. At the same time, and despite having seemingly won the battle, Bryennios's army fell into disorder after its own Pecheneg allies attacked its camp. Reinforced by Turkish mercenaries, Alexios lured the troops of Bryennios into another ambush through a feigned retreat. The rebel army broke, and Bryennios himself was captured. The battle is known through two detailed accounts: Anna Komnen's Alexiad, and her husband Nicephorus Bryennios the Younger's material for history, on which Anna's own account relies to a large degree. It is one of the few Byzantine battles described in detail, and hence a valuable source for studying the tactics of the Byzantine army of the late 11th century. Background: after the defeat of the Battle of Manzikert in 1071 against the Seljuk Turks and the overthrow of Romanos IV Diogenes, the Byzantine Empire experienced a decade of near-continuous internal turmoil and rebellions. The constant warfare depleted the empire's armies, devastated Asia Minor and left it defenseless against the increasing encroachment of the Turks. In the Balkans, invasions by the Pechenegs and the Cumans devastated Bulgaria, and the Serbian princes renounced their allegiance to the empire. The government of Michael VII Ducas failed to deal with the situation effectively, and rapidly lost support among the military aristocracy. In late 1077, two of the empire's leading generals, Nicephorus Bryennios the Elder, the Duke of Dyrrhachium in the Western Balkans, and Nicephorus Botaniates, the strategos of the Anatolic theme in Central Asia Minor, were proclaimed emperors by their troops. Bryennios set out from Dyrrhachium towards the imperial capital Constantinople, winning widespread support along the way and the loyalty of most of the empire's Balkan field army. He preferred to negotiate at first, but his offers were rebuffed by Michael VII. Bryennios then sent his brother John to lay siege to Constantinople. Unable to overcome its fortifications, the rebel forces soon retired. This failure led the capital's nobility to turn to Botaniates instead. In March 1078, Michael VII was forced to abdicate and retire as a monk, and Nicephorus Botaniates was accepted into the city as emperor. At first Botaniates lacked enough troops to oppose Bryennios, who in the meantime had consolidated his control over his native Thrace, effectively isolating the capital from the remaining imperial territory in the Balkans. Botaniates sent an embassy under the proedros Constantine Quaesfactus, a veteran diplomat, to conduct negotiations with Bryennios. At the same time he appointed the young Alexios Komnenos as his domestic of the schools, and sought aid from the Seljuk Sultan Suleiman, who sent 2,000 warriors and promised even more. In his message to Bryennios, the aged Botaniates offered him the rank of Caesar and his nomination as heir to the throne. Bryennios agreed in principle, but added a few conditions of his own, and sent the ambassadors back to Constantinople for confirmation. Botaniates, who likely had initiated negotiations only to gain time, rejected Bryennios's conditions, and ordered Alexios Komnenos to campaign against the rebel. Prelude: Bryennios had camped to the plain of Cadoctus on the road to Constantinople. His army comprised 12,000 mostly seasoned men from the regiments of Thessaly, Macedonia and Thrace, as well as Frankish mercenaries and the elite tagma of the Hetaeraea. Alexius's forces included 2,000 Turkish horse archers, 2,000 Chaumetenois from Asia Minor, a few hundred Frankish knights from Italy, and the newly raised regiment of the Immortals, which had been created by Michael VII as a chief minister Nicephorus and was intended to form the nucleus of a new army. Estimates of Alexius's total force vary from 5,500–6,500 to some 8,000–10,000, but it is clear that he was at a considerable disadvantage against Bryennios. Not only was his force considerably smaller, but also far less experienced than Bryennios's veterans. Alexius's forces set forth from Constantinople and camped on the shore of the river Harmairos, a small stream between Heraclea and Selembria, modern Kalavrye, near the fort of Kalavrye. Curiously, and against established practice, he did not fortify his camp, perhaps so as not to fatigue or dishearten his men with an implicit admission of weakness. He then sent his Turkish allies to scout out Bryennios's disposition, strength and intentions. Alexius's spies easily accomplished their tasks, but on the eve of the battle some were captured and Bryennios too was informed of Alexius's strength. Battle. Initial dispositions and plans. Bryennios arranged his army in the typical 3 divisions, each in 2 lines, as prescribed by the Byzantine military manuals. The right wing, under his brother John, was 5,000 strong and comprised his Frankish mercenaries, Thessalian cavalry, the Hetaeraea, and the Maniacartae regiment. His left wing, 3,000 men from Thrace and Macedonia, was placed under Catacolone Tarchanaiots, and the center, under Bryennios himself, comprised 3,000–4,000 men from Thessaly, Thrace and Macedonia. Again, according to standard doctrine, on his far left, about half a kilometer from the main force, he had stationed an outflanking detachment of Pechenegs. Alexios deployed his smaller army in waiting near Bryennios's camp, and divided it in 2 commands. The left, which confronted Bryennios's strongest division, was commanded by himself and contained the Frankish knights to the right and the Immortals to the Franks' left. The right command was under Constantine Catacolone, and comprised the Chaumetenois and the Turks. The latter, according to the Alexiad, were given the role of flank guard and tasked with observing and countering the Pechenegs. Conversely, on the extreme left Alexios formed his own flanking detachment, concealed from enemy view inside a hollow. Given his inferiority, Alexios was forced to remain on the defensive. His only chance at success was that his outflankers, concealed by the broken terrain, would surprise and create enough confusion among Bryennios's men for him and his strong left wing to break through their lines. Alexius's army collapses as the rebel forces advance towards his enemy's line. Alexius's flankers sprung their ambush. Their attack did indeed cause some initial confusion, but Bryennios rallied his men and led forth the second line. This counter-attack broke Alexius's flankers. As they retreated in panic, they fell upon the Immortals, who also panicked and fled, abandoning their posts. Although they suffered some casualties from Bryennios's pursuing men, most managed to escape well to the rear of Alexius's army. Alexios, who was fighting with his retinue alongside the Franks, did not immediately realize that his left wing had collapsed. In the meantime, on his right wing, the Chaumetenois, engaged with Tarchanaiots's men, were outflanked and attacked in the rear by the Pechenegs, who had somehow evaded Alexius's Turkish flank guards. The Chaumetenois too broke and fled, and Alexius's fate seemed sealed. At this point the Pechenegs failed to follow up their success, and instead turned back and began looting Bryennios's own camp. After gathering what plunder they could, they left the battle and made for their homes. Nevertheless, Bryennios's victory seemed certain, for his wings began to envelop Alexis's Franks in the center. Realizing his position and despairing in the face of defeat, Alexios at first resolved to attempt an all-or-nothing attack on Bryennios himself to decapitate the enemy army, but was dissuaded by his servant. With only 6 of his men around him, he then managed to break through the surrounding enemy soldiers. Confusion reigned behind their lines as a result of the Pecheneг attack on the rebel camp, and in this tumult Alexios saw Bryennios's imperial parade horse, with his 2 swords of state, being driven away to safety. Alexios and his men charged the escort, seized the horse, and rode away with it from the battlefield. Having reached a hill behind his army's original position, Alexios began to regroup his army from the units that had broken. He sent out messengers to rally his scattered men with news that Bryennios had been killed, showing his parade horse as evidence. At the same time, the promised Turkish reinforcements began arriving at the scene, lifting his men's morale. All the while, on the battlefield, Bryennios's army had closed around Alexios's Franks, who dismounted and offered to surrender. In the process, the rebel army had become totally disordered, with units mixed and their formations disordered. Bryennios's reserves had been thrown in confusion by the Pecheneг attack, while his front lines relaxed, thinking that the battle was over. Alexios's counter-attack, having restored his surviving forces to order, and aware of the confusion in Bryennios's forces, Alexios decided to counter-attack. The plan he laid out made far greater use of the particular skills of his Turkish horse archers. He divided his force into 3 commands, of which 2 were left behind in ambush. The other, formed from the Immortals and the Chomotenoir under Alexios's own command, was not arrayed in one continuous line, but broken up in small groups, intermingled with other groups of Turkish horse archers. This command would advance on the rebels, attack them, then feign retreat and draw them into the ambush. The attack of Alexios's division initially caught Bryennios's men off guard, but, being veteran troops, they soon recovered and once again began to push it back. Retreating, Alexios's troops, and especially the Turks, employed skirmishing tactics, attacking the enemy line and then withdrawing swiftly, thus keeping their opponents at bay and weakening the coherence of their line. Some among Alexios's men chose to attack Bryennios, and the rebel general had to defend against several attacks himself. When the battle reached the place of the ambush, Alexios's wings, likened in the Alexiad to a swarm of wasps, attacked the rebel army on the flanks, firing arrows and shouting loudly, spreading panic and confusion among Bryennios's men. Despite the attempts of Bryennios and his brother John to rally them, their army broke and fled, and other units, which were following behind, did likewise. The 2 brothers tried to put up a rearguard defense, but they were overcome and captured. Aftermath. The battle marked the end of Bryennios's revolt. Although Nicephorus Basileus gathered up much of Bryennios's defeated army and attempted to claim the throne for himself, he too was defeated by Alexios Komnenos, who then proceeded to expel the Pechenegs from Thrace. The elder Bryennios was blinded on Botanias's orders, but the emperor later took pity on him and restored him in his titles and his fortune. After Alexios Komnenos seized the throne himself in 1081, Bryennios was further honored with high dignities. He even held command during Alexios's campaigns against the Pechenegs, and defended Adrianople from a rebel attack in 1095. His son or grandson, Nicephorus Bryennios the Younger, was married to Alexios's daughter Anna Komnena. He became a prominent general of Alexios's reign, eventually raised to the rank of Caesar, and a historian.